Hi, I'm Jeremy, or Dr. J,
And I'm Ronnie West.
and this is Good Parents, Good Children.
Studies show that half of parents are below average. By watching this show, you're automatically in the top half. The goal of parenting is for us to produce young adults that are virtuous and competent. So you can essentially think about this as good people that are good at life. If your children are successful in this, if they are able to appropriately and effectively pursue this, they are becoming more virtuous, they're becoming more competent. This will lead to them, the old cliche of, I want to make the world a better place. This is the way they can do this. If they're more virtuous and competent, then everyone who meets them, everyone who is around them is going to be better off for having been around them. Not only that, but this is better than the pursuit of happiness, because when you do this, you experience life as being more meaningful and having a purpose. You're pursuing virtue, you're pursuing competence, you get this meaning out of life, and happiness follows. Can't leave any parenting tools on the table with a goal like this. This goal for your children is too important. It's too important for them, it's too important for you, and it's too important for everyone they're going to meet when they leave your house and you don't have as much influence on them anymore. You need to be successful with this.
All right, so this is parents should punish, and we're saying something that for a lot of the world is really disagreeable. So it begs the question, why should parents punish? Here's why. Kids show up wild. They do not show up as blank slates so that you can mold them however you like. And they do not show up, as you know, as perfect little angels prepared to meet the challenges of life on their own. They do not show up as only ill-tempered devils, as you'll know from any of the sweet moments that you have with your children. But they do show up uncivilized and unready, with some desires, with conflicting instincts. So kids show up not ready to live in society, to live with their siblings, or be in a family. They show up focused completely on themselves, but they also want to have this positive relationship with you.
Well, you mentioned two words for that I think are really good: sweet and wild. Right? Like that captures the two sides, because the kids, when they're young, and as they get older, this remains true to some degree, they're wild and uncivilized, they're unruly, they don't know what the rules are, they don't know what everything means and what there is to do. So that's this wild side. They also really want your approval, and they want that attention and social contact, and that's the sweet side. So there's these two sides to the coin, and parents are, part of your duty is to mediate those things. You're trying to mediate between the wild and the sweetness, and you're trying to get the wildness under more control so they can learn the rules of life, learn how to control their impulses, so they can stay within the bounds of different situations and be successful.
And so when your sweet child shows up and you want them to turn into a sweet adult, they're going to have full freedom to live life as they wish. And one of the things then that we're doing as parents is helping them appreciate this interchange between full freedom and boundedness, right? And so what should my limits of freedom be?
Right. And you don't want to make, the sort of the two common errors would be being overly rigid. So then you take the wildness and you're like, we've got to civilize this. And so you're overly rigid. I don't think that is a common problem in our American Western society too much. The other would be too much freedom. So the expectations are really low as to how civilized and how many impulses they have to say no to. The expectations are really low. You also sometimes see sort of a unplanned, bizarre combination where some parents, they feel the need to be really rigid about some stuff and really free about others, and it ends up not being bounded in like a logical, it's not planned in a reasonable sort of a way. You can be strict about some things and free about others. I think you can make a strong argument for that. Maybe that's the best way to do it, is to have a nice mix. depending on which areas you're thinking are the most important or your child's inclinations and temperament. But it needs to be planned and thoughtful with your goals and what they need in mind.
Well, this is this difference with the wilding and the chaos is building up in the living room, but the parent really isn't doing much about it until finally it's like, I've had enough, and you're in there yelling, it's, I'm really laying the law down, and you guys are going to get it right, and the kids of course learn, oh, when mom does this, then I have to sit nicely and quietly and kind of wait for it to be over. But it's not until. Well, that's right. And
the fever pitch
hits. And then in a day or so, I'm going to be back to doing my usual routine.
Right. That's an interesting take on like the third problem. You've got overly rigid, overly free, bizarre combo. Maybe that's not even that bizarre. It's too much freedom because I don't want to intervene. Too much freedom because I don't want to intervene. I'm having to let my anger get to the point where I'm motivated enough to finally intervene. So then when I'm finally out of my children are out of control and I have to allow myself to get a certain amount of out of control before I intervene. So you're actually being a bad example to the child anyway, because instead of intervening like Spock, and you're able to be sort of calm and logical and say, that's against the rules, this is a punishment. Not that that's easy to do when you're in the middle of punishing, but that is sort of the goal. Instead of pursuing that way of doing things, it's got to get my anger up high enough so I'm motivated to do this, and then you intervene.
So this is some of our parents that punish ineffectively because it's got that inconsistent quality to it.
Right.
But what about, as we keep coming back to, what about our parents who have decided, well, I'm just not going to punish at all?
Well, so there's a couple things. One, we need to think about, so what is the punishment? We talked about how you can fail. So the success is some kind of combination between appropriate freedom, appropriate boundaries. That's what's going to lead to success.
Okay.
So in very generic terms, how much freedom is the appropriate amount of freedom? How many boundaries are appropriate? And the guiding principle has to do with maturation and what they can handle. So you start off with some kind of baseline when they're 1 or 2 and they have very little freedom, and you start to set up certain boundaries. You take like a 2-year-old, and I've heard this said, I think this was in the Love and Logic parenting books. They talked about how a 2-year-old is as smart as a very smart German Shepherd. You can teach a German Shepherd to sit and stay. You can teach a German Shepherd to come when called. You can teach a 2-year-old this, right? So you take what you can get your 2-year-old to do, come when called, stop, and that's the boundary. That's the first piece. And so you create this freedom boundary ratio that's appropriate. So that's what success looks like. And then overly rigid would be more boundaries than are appropriate, and too much freedom would be far too much, right? You start at the baseline and you grow it, and you see what the child can handle that's appropriate.
Well, and I'm thinking about like, how much is this being internalized in the child? Like, okay, I've given you this much rope. Did you show that you're responsible with it? You're using your rope to walk a dog or use a jump rope. You're not using it like to hang yourself, right? And so yes, and so as the child improves in responsibility, as they set and respect their own boundaries, you're able to offer more degrees of freedom. It's not total freedom. They're learning to internalize your rules.
Right. And we talked a minute ago about being intentional, planning ahead. So, I mean, there are parents that are successful with this balance, and they don't have to write it all out or think super overtly about it, but somehow they are going through the process of mediating themselves and growing with the child. They're getting a sense for the amount of responsibility the child is able to handle, and they're slowly growing it as it needs to be grown. So the amount of success you have with that balance has to do with, you know, how well you're perceiving what they're able to handle and then adjust to that. So we're advocating for the importance of punishment, why you should punish. We've got to hit the caveat of, well, what about the kids who seem to do really well, but the parents are pursuing a non-punishment strategy, or they don't seem to be punishing effectively? We're going to focus more on they pursue a non-punishment strategy. Right. So they're positive parents. They're doing the positive parenting deal. They try to avoid punishing, and then it seems like they do really well. So, well, what about that? Well, okay, so there are several things. One, from what we have seen as mental health professionals and parents, that is, it's very rare that is successful. you also have the difficulty of this, like we've mentioned before, positive parenting techniques can be useful techniques. The issue is not that their techniques are all wrong. The issue is that we don't want to set a useful tool aside and refuse to use it. And punishment is a useful tool. There is another issue with positive parenting techniques is it often ends up costing the parent a lot more time. So they're more time intensive. So the tool of punishment is not one you want to overuse, but you get the results quicker, which is really useful if you're busy with other things, or if you want to have a lot of kids. You're going to struggle doing positive parenting when you've got 4, 6, 8 kids. You just don't necessarily have the time to do everything you want to do. And just refusing to use punishment decreases the effectiveness. Now, as we alluded to before, punishment's inevitable. So not only do we think that it would be less effective and rare and more time consuming for parents, there's also the issue that we're not sure it really exists, or I should say, we're pretty sure it doesn't exist. They are using punishment is coming into play. So if the parent refuses to punish, well, when the kid acts out in school, they're going to get interventions by the teacher. And even if the teacher is a non-punishing teacher, they're not going to get the same level of attention. They're not going to get the same level of positivity. There's subtle consequences for their behaviors, as we talked about.
Well, and they're going to get punishment from their peers.
Yeah.
Right. And okay. Now there is this kind of dandelions versus orchids things to consider as well. So in actual flowers, a dandelion is a flower you can plant just about anywhere, and it fairly well grows okay. And an orchid, which is a more beautiful flower, requires just the right watering, just the right soil, just the right tenderness. And if you mess up in any way, it's going to end up dying. This metaphor has been used, and this is true with respect to kind of knowledge potential or even IQ development. That there's a certain boundary to where you just can't kind of mess up. Like some kids are gonna fairly well turn out okay, but when you talk about some of these outliers, like a Mozart, for instance, you just can't make that if you don't water it well, if you don't soil it well. And so this is why we're talking about, well, okay, I tried to produce this great flower, but I left out the soil or the sunlight or the water. You're not going to be able to do that with children. So I'm only using soil because sunlight and water aren't on the table because, it hurts my feelings to use those.
I don't want to drown the poor child.
I don't. But I will say this is something that I encountered a good bit of back when I was a child therapist. Was doing behavior therapy in home, in school, sometimes in the clinic, and you find that so much of what we're teaching when we're working with these families is this is how you do like a behavioral intervention, and it's absolutely got some reinforcement in there because you want to make sure that you're reinforcing positive behavior. It tends to have a greater behavioral yield than does punishment. What tends to have the greatest behavioral yield is if you've got a mixture. If you're reinforcing positive behaviors, if you're punishing negative behaviors.
Well, in the reinforcement, that kicks back into one of our previous videos where we talked about you want to be consistent and you want to be confident and you want to be caring, right? Well, when you're caring, you're giving lots of feedback on what are you doing right? I mean, if punishment is not, and I think this is part of the reason why you get the anti-punishment advocates that are really upset about punishment, is they see punishment done poorly. They see punishment done without the caring or an appropriate amount of positive feedback. And if a child doesn't know what success looks like, if they don't know what they need to do to get positives from the parent, then any negatives that are thrown their way, any punishments are going to reduce in effectiveness. So we're really, in these videos, we're really focusing on don't leave that tool on the table. But you can't overstate how important it is to have a caring relationship. And then specific, I really appreciate how you did X. Thank you for doing this. And there's different techniques you can use to point out the things that they're doing that you want to encourage, that are helpful and good. And then they have the script for, instead of this negative behavior that gets me in trouble, what do I replace it with? If you don't offer that up to them and encourage it, they're not going to know how to go from negative behavior to positive. That's sort of an aside, but that's all part of the caring that we're talking about that can make punishment more effective.
Well, and remember that the kid shows up wild, right? So chaos in the infant and in the toddler is a natural part of it. So you're going to expect that, since we talked about 2-year-olds, you're going to expect your 2-year-old, they're beginning to autonomize a little bit, trying to do their own thing, trying to take control of their environment. Some tantrums are coming. Can you manage those well? Can you help the kid manage their emotional distress? Can you punish the behavior in a loving and effective way? Your 5-year-old's not going to have tantrums.
Yeah,
but
that's the investment.
That's the investment. But if you don't, then the child's going to learn the effectiveness of the tantrum, how they can punish you, how they can decrease that behavior. Like, mom didn't give me what I wanted. They're at the checkout line, or didn't let me download like the digital content I wanted for my game, so I'll tantrum, and then I'll get what I want, right? And so then you've got like I found in my behavioral practice, you've got kids who've been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, or even like a mood disorder, and they would kind of all come down to, well, the kid never learned how to manage emotions because the parent never punished the behavior, so the kid didn't have to sit with like the guilt of having done wrong.
Right. And we need, so if you think about not able to manage emotions, right? So you were talking about tantrums earlier, right? A tantrum is a combination of several things. Okay. Let's say they have a tantrum. Almost always having a tantrum has to do with having been told no in some form, right? A boundary is set on the child. They're really upset about it. So then they've got this emotional outburst. Okay. So in a sense, you're not punishing the emotion, right? Because emotion is sort of the result of the behaviors and the thoughts. What you're doing is you're punishing them for inflicting their emotion on other people inappropriately. You do that when they're really young, so they know how to have more reasonable responses to things, and then it doesn't become a problem when they're older and they're bigger. And this speaks to some of the things we've been thinking about when it comes to what are the consequences when parents don't punish. You were just talking about illustrating mental health problems with their kids, and this comes out later. If kids don't get appropriate training, which is almost always going to need to include punishment if you want to be really successful with it, then if they don't get the training they need, mental health problems into the teen years, which goes into the adult years, it's almost, I think it's basically inevitable. This is going to happen. They need to be trained how to manage their emotions. They need to have parents that are showing an example of managing their emotions appropriately. They need to be trained on how to do this. And that includes not inflicting overly powerful emotions on other people inappropriately. And there's a lot of consequences from these things when punishment is left on the table throughout life. This doesn't just stop in childhood.
Well, when you impress emotions, especially these strong negative emotions, onto other people, you end up chasing away your peers. So you're going to have like a punished life because you'll have less of that kind of peer interaction.
Because all of your peer relationships have this impact on you at the moment and in the future, and they affect all your future peer relationships, right? So friends, you won't even understand the loss because you won't even know what you lost. It's the things you would have learned at the right age early enough from those peers that you lost out on.
Well, and there's potential mentor relationships too, because we're talking about school teachers, but you can be someone who loves kids and loves helping kids, and still notice the standout, well-behaved child and think, well, that's potentially somebody I could be of use to, right? That's my protege or mentee.
People are not only are other kids peers drawn to them to be friends with the well-behaved child, the civilized child, the child whose wildness has been mediated appropriately. The sweetness and the wildness have been mediated, and they've been learning. The peers are attracted to them to become their friends. The adults are attracted to them to give them feedback, tips, pat in the back, all these little mentor, even if it's just little things, compliments from strangers that say, wow, you were really well behaved for your parents at this restaurant. that has an impact on the kid. That interaction goes on in the future, and it's impossible unless the child was trained so that they behaved that way to get that positive interaction with adults later. So these are all the things these are a bunch of the things that are lost when someone leaves.
All right, so we had some tech issues, but listen, man, bottom line me, Ronnie, what's the goal of parenting?
So the goal of parenting is for us as parents to produce young adults that are virtuous and competent. Or another way to put it is that they are effectively pursuing virtue and competence, because that's a long-term path.
We want good people doing good things.
Exactly. And when you're successful at this, you are making life better for everyone you encounter. So you think about some of the goals people sometimes might have for their kids, or some of the things people say would be like, I want to make the world a better place. I want my children to be able to make the world a better place. Well, that is really hard to pull off, and there's some problems with thinking about it that way. But if you're pursuing virtue and competence, you really are making things better for the people you encounter. And if you think the goal for your child is you want them to be happy, right? I have problems with that conceptualization. But if you're pursuing virtue and competence, you get a strong feeling of meaning and the purpose in life. That will lead to being more satisfied and being happier. So these goals, this idea of pursuing virtue and competence, this leads your children towards all the things you want for them. The things you want for them like this, but also if you think about, you want your child to be successful in their education, in their career, in avoiding addiction, in a content and successful romantic relationship, socially, all of those things. If they pursue virtue and competence, it all starts working out better.
And so if you're aiming at virtue and competence, you're going to produce a healthy, satisfied, contented child that's going to grow into an adult who's got a life of meaning. And when they're more virtuous, then that actually does make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And why should you punish? Because the stakes are way too high, right? Because the goal is too important not to. Because putting out competent and like generative adult citizens means that we can't be leaving things on the table just because they don't match how we wish the world was. Like, I wish I didn't need to punish my children, and I wish my parents didn't need to punish me. But if we're all going to live together, then we actually do need that.
You've got to make this happen, and we've got to do everything within our power to make it happen. We need our kids to be pursuing virtue and competence as they are growing up, as children, the way that is appropriate for their age, as teens, and then definitely into adulthood.
Until next time.
Hi, I'm Ronnie West.
I'm Jeremy, Dr. J.
This is Good Parents, Good Children.
You'll be smarter than you were an hour ago.